Ruth Brooks was 70 years old and had passed much of his life supporting the others, first to her husband, a man full of dreams that rarely came true, and then to his son Marcus, who seemed life-chained to his own errors. Even so, she maintained the conviction that the family had to be above everything. That's why, when Marcus, he called desperately saying he was going to lose the house, he didn't hesitate. He took out his savings, $80,000, and they were given to him. Handed over. Although signed a contract, in the background she didn't want to papers neither guarantees. What I wanted was to believe that this gesture was enough to protect the family harmony. During the first weeks received calls, photos of the grandchildren, messages, affectionate ones that you gave the illusion that there was made it correct. With he passed of the time, however, began to notice cracks that were disturbing. Marcus and his wife Rebecca no longer cared they invited with the same frequency, and the excuses for not receiving her became more elaborate. Ruth tried to convince themselves that it was normal, that the busy life of a couple young with children justified the distance, but something didn't add up. His intuition, he said, there was an uncomfortable truth behind those smiles, forced and evasive answers. That one sensation, still diffuse, was growing until reaching the day in which everything broke. That day, it started like any other, another, but would end up proving that his generosity had been converted into a weapon against her. One Saturday at night tomorrow, Ruth decided to drop by Marcus's house by surprise. He hadn't given any warning, because in the last few weeks, he always found some reason to avoid it: work, tiredness, school meetings. When parked in front of the house, first one who called his attention was the new car in the entrance, shiny, with a newly issued license plate. He thought it must be from some neighbor, but as he approached, confirmed that it belonged to his son. He felt empty in his stomach. There was heard that the financial situation was unsustainable. They were on the verge of losing everything. But there was the proof that something didn't fit. With a knot in the throat, touched the doorbell, hoping to see her grandchildren. Rebecca was who opened the door. His face tensed at the sight of her, as if the unexpected visit seemed like an intrusion. Even thus, the let pass. Inside the house, Ruth noticed other detail that threw me off. The table was set for an elegant dinner, with wine glasses and plates that would have bought if they were really in crisis. He even saw in the kitchen boxes of expensive products and fresh flowers in every corner. Minutes later, Marcus appeared, surprised and somewhat uncomfortable, trying to hide his with hugs. Ruth tried to smile, but inside, she felt as the parts of the puzzle were starting to fit together worse way. Your money had not been enough to save the home of his son, but to finance luxuries. Ruth tried not to accuse anyone nor make a scene. He walked through the hallway, greeted the children, noticed new backpacks and expensive toys, details that confirmed the suspects that he burned his stomach. Marcus spoke quickly, changing the subject, pointing small improvements in the house as if it wanted to distract her. Rebecca contributed measured comments, the kind that justify expenses as necessary when it has already been taken the decision. In the head of Ruth, the number of the 80,000 was splitting in purchases, installments, dinners, card installments, all unrelated to the urgency that supposedly there was pushed to ask for help. He didn't need discuss it. The air already was filled with the discomfort that everyone recognized. She left later with a smile she didn't feel, telling herself that the important thing was to be close to her grandchildren, and that maybe I was exaggerating. However, that evening in his room, he mentally reviewed each sign and understood that the distance was not a coincidence. It was a way of maintaining it out while money evaporated. Days after arrive, the invitation that seemed a patch of affection on a wound open. Marcus proposed that Ruth pass the holiday with them, and that, if you liked it, they thought in living together to be more united. In the surface, sounded tender. In he, background, to her you, it sounded like a deal where the independence was given up in exchange for company. He imagined scheduled taxes, kitchen always in charge, caring for the children as an obligation, and their small apartment in the retirement community becoming empty and then dispensable. Even so, he agreed to go on the holiday trip because he wanted to see the grandchildren, and why still? There was a part of her that wished everything would just be right. She packed a small suitcase with comfortable clothes, your medications ordered in a pillbox, documents in a plastic envelope, and some inexpensive but thoughtful gifts for the children. He promised himself, same as I would put limits if they appeared demands disguised as affection, and he prepared for a weekend that without know it, you was going to change life. The journey began with a silent tension that Ruth tried not to recognize. In the car, Marcus was driving looking straight ahead. Rebecca was checking her phone, without speak, and the children were dozing in a seat rear. She had prepared small games and sweets to entertain them, but no one was paying too much attention. In his insides kept repeating that he just wanted to enjoy those days, which did not matter whatever there would be uncovered in the previous visit, which family was worth more than the resentments. However, the evasive glances of his son and Rebecca's cutting tone when responded to any comment they were mining, that illusion was like being in a shared journey, but without truly belong to it. When the car stopped in a remote viewpoint, Ruth thought it was a break to rest and stretch her legs. The landscape was desert-like, with mountains along far away and a dry wind that tangled her hair. It came down slowly, gasping for air, and it was so when Marcus approached with a hard expression, nothing like the son he had raised. He spoke to him of the money, from the debt that made no sense to maintain between them, of how unfair it was that I would claim it when what there was fact was to save the family. Rebecca joined the scene, even more frontal, accusing her of putting her money above the grandchildren. Ruth tried to defend herself, to explain that it wasn't a matter of love, but of respect, but her words trailed off. In an air full of reproach, it was in that moment when the reality broke in pieces. The exchange escalated in tone a matter of seconds. Marcus insisted in which I should forgive the debt, which was just money, and that the true proof of love was to let it go. Ruth, with his voice trembling but firm, he said he couldn't accept that manipulation, which had worked all his life to save and that already had sacrificed too much for them. Rebecca crossed the arms and threw cruel phrases, reminding him that he was old woman, who should be grateful to have a place in his family, which without they were nobody. Every word it was, like a sharp blow that is not forgotten. Ruth felt her knees. They faltered, but they held on in the edge of the railing with the dignity that was left. What happened after was the lowest blow of all. Marcus turned, made a quick gesture to Rebecca, and without further ado, they climbed into the children to the car. Ruth thought it was a way to pressure her, that they would return in minutes. But instead, I'm listening the noise of the engine starting and the vehicle moving away between the dust cloud of the desert. He stayed motionless, with your suitcase still in her floor, her bag with the medicines in a seat rear, and the dry wind hitting him in the face. It took a while to understand that they had left there, alone, without water, without transportation, and miles away from any town. The feeling was not only of physical abandonment, it was the brutal confirmation that, for him own son, she was expendable. For several minutes, Ruth remained still, unable to process what had just happened. The silence of the place was overwhelming, interrupted only by the buzzing of the wind and the distant echo of some vehicle in the road. I looked the road empty within disbelief, wondering if they would come back to laugh, if this was a cruel joke that would soon end. But the minutes turned in almost an hour, and the only thing that grew in she was the certainty that they had truly abandoned me. I felt dry mouth, the heart beating with strength and a mixture of anger and sadness that squeezed the chest. He thought in the $80,000, in the fake calls. Every time there was allowed himself to be convinced that it was exaggerated. And he understood that the scene was not improvised. It had been planned. Finally, a young man who worked at a gas station close passed by the viewpoint with his truck. He saw her standing, alone, with the expression broken, and stopped worried. Ruth could hardly explain to him through tears what had happened. But the boy didn't need details to give, realized that he was in front of a woman older, vulnerable, and in shock. He offered her take her to the nearest town where she could call your sister Helen. When I'm listening, Helen's voice on the other end of the line could not contain he crying. I felt shame, humiliation, and deep desolation, but also a relief immense if it hadn't been stranded forever in that place. When Helen arrived at the little one town to pick it up, the impact was immediately seeing his sister Major sitting in a bank with the wrinkled clothes, the pale face, and the eyes swollen with crying. He felt a mixture of compassion and anger. Ruth tried to explain to him it happened between sobs, but Helen interrupted firmly. They always were so. You just didn't want to see it. The phrase fell like a bucket of water frozen, because Ruth knew it was true. She remembered all the loans small, the excuses, the times in which Marcus made you feel guilty if you didn't help. Now, after having handed over his savings and his confidence, it was seen with clarity that everything had been part of a pattern of emotional and economic abuse that he carried on years. Return. At Helen's house, Ruth tried to rest, but she could barely close her eyes. Eyes without revive the sound of the engine moving away in that road deserted. The psychological blow had been so strong as physical abandonment. In the midst of that storm of emotions, she discovered that Marcus and Rebecca not only had left without help, they had used their credit card in his absence. The extracts showed recent purchases in restaurants and luxury shops, right in the days in which she had been trapped in the desert. That observation, it ended up breaking something inside her. It wasn't just ingratitude, it was deliberate abuse. It was so when he understood that if he did not put a definitive limit, would continue being treated as a source of money, disposable until the end of his days. The decision to no longer be victim arose in the middle of a sleepless night. Ruth got out of bed, turned on the lamp, and began to review each receipt, each transfer, each statement bank account that I had saved with meticulousness for months. See it all in order, with dates and amounts, filled with a mixture of indignation and determination. Already it wasn't just a matter of recovering money, but of recovering their dignity. At dawn, he called a lawyer recommended by a Helen's neighbor and told what happened with his voice still broken but without hiding details. The lawyer, I'm listening in silence, and in the end, said something that returned a little force. This is not just a family problem, it is a crime. With his guide, Ruth hired also to a private investigator. The days following were intense, full of painful revelations. They discovered that Marcus had a serious problem with the gambling and had accumulated debts in different states. Rebecca, for her part, maintained an ostentatious lifestyle that he displayed on social media, posting photos of expensive dinners and short trips, while referring to his mother-in-law as a naive or even as a truxer. The most shocking thing was discover that it was the first time that both of them had cheated on an older relative. There was a history of others' relatives who had been manipulated to get money. They even found messages where they planned go to Mexico with the children and start from scratch with false identities. Each piece of information was a knife, but also one more reason for Ruth to hold his decision to face them to the end. The legal battle began with a low blow. Marcus and Rebecca filed a false complaint in Services Social, claiming that Ruth was an unbalanced woman who had abandoned her grandchildren in several times. The intention was clear: to divert the attention and demoralize it. For Ruth, reading those accusations, it was like being stabbed, because they didn't just attack his integrity financial, but also her most sacred role, that of grandmother. However, this time she was not alone. Her lawyer got recent medical tests, showed that Ruth was in perfect cognitive and physical condition, and collected testimonies from neighbors and friends who gave faith in his independent and organized life. Each document presented was a stone that knocked down the false narrative that Marcus and Rebecca were trying to construct. Following months were a parade of hearings, depositions, and cross-examinations. Ruth attended every session with racing heart, but with head held high. Sometimes I doubted having the enough energy to continue, but remembered the image of that car moving away and found forces where I didn't think they were left. It was during that process that the investigation was expanded. The police, and then the FBI, discovered that Marcus and Rebecca weren't acting alone. They were part of a larger network dedicated to defrauding seniors in different states, moving hundreds of thousands of dollars under the guise of family loans or investments fictional. What began as a case of domestic betrayal turned into in a large-scale criminal investigation. The fall of Marcus and Rebecca was as abrupt as it is inevitable. With the evidence accumulated by the prosecutor's office, bank records and publications on Rebecca's social networks showing luxuries, the case became impossible for them to sustain. The police they stopped when were trying to cross the border towards Mexico with fake passports and the children in a seat rear. The news, it came to Ruth through a call from her lawyer. They caught them. She remained in silence for a few seconds, processing those words. There were no happiness immediate, just a mixture of relief and sadness. Because although we're guilty, they continued being his son and the mother of his grandchildren. And that, true, you tore he heart. The trial that followed revealed the magnitude of the damage. Dozens of elderly people deceived. In different states, millions of dollars were diverted, and a pattern of manipulation that was going far beyond what Ruth had imagined. When the prosecutors they showed photos of Rebecca in luxury hotels and Marcus's betting slips, Ruth felt a pang of shame, as if their actions stained his own surname. But at the same time, he understood that facing that reality with the head high was part of his healing. It wasn't about hiding, but about accepting that she had been a victim and that now was helping to make the true came to light. After the arrest and the trial, Ruth began a slow but steady process of reconstruction. With the help from your sister Helen and her lawyer, managed to recover part of the money thanks to the seizure of assets and the sale of the house that Marcus and Rebecca had bought with luxuries undue. It wasn't the full amount, but it meant much more than numbers. It was the proof that his voice had had weight, that he had achieved, that the justice was imposed where before there was only abuse and manipulation. Little by little, it was putting his accounts back together and reorganizing his life, no longer as someone who lived pending the needs of the others, but as a woman who understood the courage to protect oneself same. The most unexpected thing came after. The Services Social. After find out the situation of the children and the imprisonment of his parents, they offered Ruth the possibility of taking temporary custody of their grandchildren. The news, overflowed with emotions. I felt fear for his age and the responsibilities that entails. It implied, but also an immense tenderness. For the first time in decades, it wasn't about giving money, nor to sustain errors not from others, but from offering a sincere and safe home. With Helen's constant support, he accepted. Thus, the house that was once synonymous with loneliness in the retirement community was transformed in a space full of laughter, children, and family routines that brought back to life. The first one's days with the grandchildren were a whirlwind of adjustments. Ruth had to completely reorganize her routine, preparing breakfast early, coordinate school schedules, check homework in the afternoon, and, at the same time, take care of your own health needs. There were nights in which it ended, exhausted, with pain in the knees and back, but still so he went to sleep with a smile that made years did not appear in his face. Every spontaneous "thank you, Grandma" from the children was a caress that slowly erased the scars from what I've been through. I knew I couldn't replace the absence of parents, but also I knew I could offer them what Marcus and Rebecca had lost in middle of his ambition: stability and affection genuine. With he. As the months passed, Ruth began to look at herself in the mirror differently. I no longer saw the fragile woman, willing to give everything to be accepted, but someone who had survived the most painful betrayal, and came out stronger. When I was walking along the neighborhood with her grandchildren by the hand, she felt that she was recovering not only her place in the family, but also the respect that always you was missing. Helen, who accompanied at every step. I used to tell him that at last had learned to put on first of all. And although Ruth still, he carried with him the pain of having his son in prison, now understood that protecting his dignity had been the only way to save himself sane and to offer a better future for children. The day he officially received custody of the grandchildren, Ruth felt that she was closing a cycle. He signed the documents with the hand trembling, but with a heart in peace. There was through months of hearings, reviews and visits from workers social that inspected his home to make sure everything was in order. Each step was a reminder of how much his life had changed since that tomorrow in the lookout, where it was abandoned as if it were worthless. Now, holding the hands of the children while we're leaving of the court, he felt that life was his. There was returned a purpose that did not depend on pleasing nor to give in to the demands of others, but to protect what really mattered. Ruth too began to share his history in small support groups for seniors victims of financial abuse. At first, Yukos talked without break, but discovered that his testimony not only freed her, but served as a warning and hope for others. Several people were approaching after the meetings to thank him for giving them courage and for showing that it's never too late to say enough. That connection gave a sense of community I'd never experienced before. For the first time in many years, she stopped feeling used and started feeling listened to, respected, and above all, in control of her life. The weather taught Ruth that true strength is not always measured in the ability to support others, but in the courage to put boundaries when necessary. Already, she did not define herself as the sacrificial mother or the widow who silently carried everything. Now she recognized herself as a woman who had survived the cruelest manipulation and that had transformed that wound into an opportunity to be reborn. Every day, with his grandchildren, was a confirmation that he had taken the decision correct. Protect yourself and protect them, although that would mean breaking up with his son, whom he had loved so much. At 70, Ruth finally understood that it is never too late to recover the dignity. There was past being the women willing to give everything for a little acceptance, to become someone who demanded respect and justice. Look in the mirror was no longer a reminder of loss, but a celebration of resilience. Story told in forums and support groups inspired others to not allow abuse, no matter the age, neither the circumstances. Ruth knew she couldn't change the past, but every day he got up with the certainty that there was gained something much more valuable than the money, the freedom to live with the head aloft.